Excellent. All right. Well, I'd like to start off by just welcoming everybody and thanking you for being here tonight. It's it's Friday night. There's a lot of places you could be, but you're here with us, and I am definitely very appreciative of that. It's great to be back here in person on campus. Over the last 2 to 3 years, I've probably done close to 40 events, all of which have been on Zoom. I will say the energy is quite a bit different. I'm really appreciating that. Before we get started, I just want to throw a shout out and a thank you to the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies, which continues to sponsor all our work down here. Additional shout out to my UWT colleagues, especially my UWT colleagues who are involved with the Labor Solidarity Project. It's great to see you here. I also, of course, wanted to put a plug in for the Pacific Northwest Labor History Association Conference, which this event is technically part of. This is kind of like a kickoff event for that. If you haven't registered for it, there's still time. The event itself is going to take place tomorrow across the street over in the Washington State History Museum. Absolutely amazing lineup. It is all killer, no filler, in my opinion. And it's also, it's in person, so it's just kind of a great opportunity to reconnect with labor activists and academics after a long couple of years off. I'd be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge the dates. It's Karl Marx's birthday. 205. But that's not, we're here for that, but we're also here, of course, for a roundtable on perspectives on labor and academia, and we have assembled an absolute all-star cast, talking about all killer, no filler, from LA to Bellingham, Washington, up and down the West Coast, to talk about their experiences in higher ed as unionized rank and file workers. They're going to be sharing the perspectives on the academic workplace, and I think in the process we're going to be talking about the past, the present, and the potential futures of what a lot of us know to be like a rapidly transforming line of work. We're also going to be, of course, emphasizing and exploring the role that solidarity can play, kind of reimagining what academic work actually is, and I think kind of transforming the way that all of us think about institutions of higher education. And of course, its role within that sort of evolving story of American labor. So we're going to use that theme of past, present, and future as a way to introduce each of our panelists, who are going to share their stories on how their perspectives have evolved over the years. So we're going to start with kind of how they initially got involved, kind of thinking in terms of the MCU, sort of like the labor origin story, and then look specifically at things they've done once they've gotten involved, and then talk a little bit about kind of how they imagine the work that they're doing currently is going to change their institutions moving forward. So in terms of formatting, I'm going to provide some really quick bios, and then we're gonna kind of spotlight each one of our panelists for kind of a quick talk, kind of going through that past, present, and future format, and then we've got a sort of structured Q&A, and then after my questions, we had some questions submitted ahead of time from some of my colleagues. We will hand it over to the rabble for some open-ended Q&A. So that's when things get real, right? We just have to make sure to wrap at 6:30, so I'm going to wrap this up quickly. We've got a musical act coming up next that needs to perform a sound check. But I would encourage you all to stick around because at 7 o'clock, we're going to be hosting authors Jess Walter and Carl Melantis, who both have recently written novels about regional labor history, so that should be pretty cool. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guests here. So first up, we have Marisa Chappell, who is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University, where she directs the History Master's Program. She served on the original organizing committee of United Academics of Oregon State University on their first bargaining team, and currently serves as the executive vice president. And at the far end there, we have Stephen Garfinkle, who's a professor of history at Western Washington University, where he's taught the ancient world for 2 decades. He was an original member of the organizing committee of the United Faculty of Western Washington, for which he's also served 2 terms as president. And then finally, hailing all the way from Los Angeles, we've got Carolyn Luce, who's a researcher and lecturer at UCLA's Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, and is also the communications chair of UCAFT, which represents lecturers and librarians across the University of California. So please join me in extending a warm UWT, Pacific Northwest Labor Association National History Conference. Welcome to our guest tonight.
It's one of the things that I most enjoyed about the work, is that I got a view of my campus by talking to colleagues in every college, every discipline, every department that I wouldn't have had, and not just a view of how effed up the operation of the campus was at that time, but also a view of the extraordinary things that my colleagues were doing, under-resourced, overworked, etc. So we began to organize, and one of the things that I actually love about that enabling legislation in our state of Washington, that unlike a lot of places, what it mandates is, and I know this is a terrible Lord of the Rings reference, but one union to rule them all. That is, we must have a wall-to-wall union for all faculty. Anyone who is designated to do faculty work is part of a single union. I love that because it can't divide, for example, better paid disciplines. I don't think there's better paid disciplines. Better paid disciplines. It separates contingent faculty from standing faculty. And one of the things I loved about our effort from the beginning was everybody had to get involved. And we had to find people everywhere on campus who felt as we did about what turned out to be three core issues: compensation, shared governance, and the statewide picture. And by that I mean Olympia. What we felt as faculty was that the faculty legislative reps that all of our campuses have for our faculty senate was not enough of a voice in Olympia to represent the public good of public higher education. So we had three goals: compensation, shared governance, Olympia, and that was a script that sold on our campus. I won't say it was easy. Similar to what Marisa said, it took a lot of time, a lot of coffee, a lot of meetings, a lot of bang on doors of recalcitrant colleagues who were not uninterested in the union, but who had no time. Because the thing we need to recognize about our colleagues is, outside of good union settings, I think everyone is doing additional uncompensated labor. Now, this certainly affects certain groups more. It affects contingent faculty more than standing faculty often. It affects BIPOC faculty and faculty of marginalized identities much more than it does traditional white male faculty, etc. And what we found through the effort was nobody had time until we made it clear to them that this was a pathway forward for them to have a voice in the operation of our university. So that I don't go on too long, let me jump a couple steps from past towards present. We succeeded. I was there in Federal Way when the votes were counted. It led to a wonderful moment because we could hear the president of our university on the phone with the head of HR who was observing the count for the university. We heard her yelling, "Make them count again." But we won the election, moved into bargaining, ultimately bargained our first successful contract. One of the things I'll highlight about all of the ways in which we were successful, so between our first contract, which was 2008, and our most recent contract, which was a year ago, Western's overall faculty compensation has moved from the bottom quartile to the top quartile of our peer institutions. And those are not peers we as faculty chose. Those are the peers our administrators chose for us. We've done that. We've established effective shared governance, which in many ways strengthens our faculty senate and makes the work that the senate does much more meaningful. And we've gained an additional voice in Olympia. And I'll give you a brief example of how fun that was. So not long after we had organized, we found out that our president, who had run what I will call a very well-resourced and very angry anti-union campaign that was full of misinformation, that president, we knew, was hoping that the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee in the state legislature, who was a Western alum, would come to Western and meet with the president. And they were having trouble getting that meeting. Well, we were newly organized. We had two big statewide affiliates down in Olympia, WEA and AFT Washington. We had them go and knock on the door of the chair of House Ways and Means. He immediately agreed to come up and talk to the union at Western. And we then called the president's office and said, "He's coming, how much time would you like?" And I use that example because not only does it demonstrate the genuine power that we can achieve through the solidarity that Alex is talking about, but it also shows that what we do is of immediate beneficial impact to our institutions. There is this odd notion that I ran into when we organized that somehow a union's goals are not the goals of the university. I would argue, and I recognize this self-serving, that our goals are much more closely aligned with the mission of the university than those that may be the goals of our administrators. But what we were able to do was put our agenda there as well and demonstrate that it was an agenda that supported the university. To get a little bit closer to the present, one of the things it's done for us is proven to be an extraordinarily important tool for recruitment and retention. Numerous faculty tell us that they made the decision to come to Western because we have a faculty union, because they met with a union rep during their interview, which is something, by the way, that our university a university president who was not the one who fought our union, but the president who came on board afterwards welcomed the idea that the union would meet with each faculty candidate for a position on campus and introduce to them what we provide to campus, what we provide to the university. We've had numerous faculty tell us that's the reason they came, it may be the reason they stay. To move towards where we are now, at the risk of sounding too satisfied, we have a very strong relationship with our administration. What I would say characterizes that is that during the course of the pandemic, and I believe I have the number right, but I may not, our university and our union signed 11 memoranda of understanding relating to how to handle working conditions under COVID. That related to additional faculty labor and how that would be compensated, that related to safety conditions, etc. So the proof of concept for even colleagues who remain skeptical on my campus in spite of the raises was the fact that when things were at their most difficult for faculty, we were able, as a faculty, to have a voice at the table to decide what our working conditions would be under the pandemic. We've come out of the pandemic. I'm happy to say, though, I take no pleasure in this, that we also bargained a contract during the mid stages of the pandemic at Western, a contract that included raises that were larger than the raises allocated by the state legislature. So demonstrating that, and we had, by the way, gotten the same initial communication that, hey, we can't really bargain right now because we assume the world's going to collapse and we'll have no money. And then 6 months later, the world hadn't collapsed. We'd all gone into the Zoom room and taught. Students had shown up, and we were able to go back to the table and bargain a contract under those normal conditions. What our present looks like, and again, I don't want to paint it too rosy, is one where the provost and the president have to consult with faculty when they make major decisions related to our wages, benefits, working conditions. What that's done is given us a seat at the table where we are legal equals. Perhaps my individual favorite memory for the time long ago when I was president of our local was when, during bargaining, the president of our university came to my office instead of my going to his as a demonstration that we were peers in this process. And this was something we'd agreed to. Sometimes I would go up to the mountain, what we call Old Main, and meet with the president, and sometimes he would come down to the history department and mingle with the faculty. And I think that demonstrates the present that we're in at Western, and I imagine, I certainly hope the future looks the same, is one where we have a voice with our administration that carries equal weight on the issues that are, in general, most important to us. And the thing I'll finish with, which is sort of a through line through the whole thing, is that what made this possible for us was the strength of our faculty organizing, the strength of the support, which only grew after we'd actually won our election. And what I would simply say is our future depends on my colleagues at Western staying as engaged as we've been in order to get where we are.
State of California, or it's called PURA, isn't it? That would be like 50,000. So it's an enormous, the scale of this, and UCLA and UC Berkeley are much larger, so we have 750 lecturers at UCLA. But that's an aside, we'll talk about that later. So I don't know, I got kind of asked to have this question on the panel because my positionality in all this is very different. I'm deeply contingent, holler to all the contingent faculty in the room. I was in graduate school during the crash in 2008, 2009. got involved in the graduate student union, UAW 2865, which just fought a major battle this past fall that I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer period. As with many of my generation of scholars, that was it. The job market just dropped off a cliff. And I was fortunate enough to stick around at UCLA. I had a postdoc for a long time, doing what people call alt-ac kind of work. I make digital history websites. Just to say that the thing that really kind of radicalized me was watching colleagues get churned out of the system. Watching colleague after colleague after colleague until I looked around and no one that I knew was left. It was just me and tenured faculty. And I'm sure anyone who's in graduate school right now or is a contingent faculty member can understand the microaggressive behavior that happens when you're around tenured folks. It was just very clear to me that they were never going to accept me as a full colleague. And so I was seeking community at that moment, frankly, and wandered my way into a union meeting, in part because I had experience, but in part because I just was like, oh, let's check this out. I wonder where all the other lectures are. Had very much that attitude of being one foot out the door. Part of that, I think, was hubris, me sort of thinking, oh, I'll get a tenure job one of these days. I had a couple campus interviews. I kept sort of thinking, I'll be out of here soon enough. The other is just how deeply we internalize our contingency, where it didn't feel like this job was going to last ever. And so I was kind of at an arm's length with the union for a long time, not because I was opposed at all, but just because I was sort of like, oh, you don't want to put me on the bargaining team. I'm going to be out of, I'm going to lose my job, or I'm going to get that tenure track job. We went into negotiations in the fall of 2019. We were doing, the way they do it at UC is they rotate the campuses. So you meet in person, but you rotate campuses and then COVID hit. And so we had already been doing open bargaining. That's something I will flag. Always ask, demand open bargaining. It's a hugely important tactic. And it took us 2.5 years to get a contract. So we bargained through COVID. We did car caravans and letter writing stuff and Zoom pep rallies. And in the middle of all of that, I was much more involved at that point, but I still, I think, had a little bit of an arm's length. And I actually went to a Zoom funeral. One of those awful, God, let us never do that again. Those are not good. Anyways, I was at the Zoom funeral for a dear colleague and mentor who had passed away, and I saw 4 of my friends from graduate school were all in the Zoom, and I was like, let's get out of here. Like, this is weird. The chancellor was talking. Let's go talk about Jan. So we went into our own Zoom, and everyone started talking about how they thought they had failed her. These are people who were working full-time, one teaching high school, another as a lecturer at BYU, another part-time at a Cal State, but working on his own business. And for all of us to see my colleagues just carrying so much sadness and this sense of failure, in a system that failed them. Like, they did not do anything wrong. And all of them are working full-time and gainfully employed and doing history. And to see them holding that sense of failure and that sense of shame, I don't know, something broke in me. I don't know. I was like, all right, that's fucking it. We're going on strike. Sorry. I have a potty mouth. I'm going to try not to swear. So, I stepped up. I took over the communications committee. We had 3 key issues we actually started out with 10 issues to our campaign, dropped everything that would cost the UC money. One of the things about the UC, and this is true of a lot of universities, my dear friend DeVarian Baldwin's book is amazing on this front. They are universities. UCLA is the #1 healthcare provider in the city of Los Angeles, a city of 4 million people. It's the #1 landowner in the city of Los Angeles. It's the #1 landlord in the city of Los Angeles. And so our members include dentists and nurses and business people and lawyers. It's a really wrangly, hard thing. And so at the outbreak of with the pandemic, they were announcing $400 million deficits. Hospitals are a great source of revenue for our campus, and so they were feigning austerity already then. And so we eliminated all of the proposals that would cost them money, and basically just focused in on workload and job security. The crazy concept that if you do a good job teaching a class, you should be offered that class again the following year. That demand took us 2.5 years to persuade the University of California to accept. In the fall of 2021, when we were finally kind of back on campus and in the classroom, at least in theory, we then had another outbreak. But whatever, false one. We were all excited. We're back on campus. We declared a strike. We took a strike authorization vote. 97% of our bargaining unit voted to strike. And literally 4 a.m., the day of the first day of the strike, we got a deal. It was very surreal. I had been up for like 36 hours. Jessica, if you're here, met me that day. I was very cracked up. The point was that, without the union at that moment, not just the COVID of it all, but just the experience of feeling like the horizon had been kind of snuffed out, like just so much bad in the world. And so what drew me to get involved in the union is it felt like one little corner of what is a catastrophe. We are living through a catastrophe in higher ed. I mean, I really don't think I can say this enough. The whole thing is crumbling down around us. And what the union provides is one little corner where you can fight back. And you know you're not gonna fix the job market. And you know you're not gonna save your colleagues' jobs. And you know you're not gonna, you might be able to help them get over that shame a little bit, but channel that shame. Don't feel ashamed, feel proud and fight back. Because the tenured aren't gonna save us. These institutions are not gonna save us. They seem to get worse every day. And so that feeling of stepping up with your colleagues, taking that control back and fighting for something better will change you. It's really, really transformative, and it's really, really amazing. In terms of the future, the kind of screwed up thing about the UC, we have all these campus unions. We are not in one big union together in the Rutgers way. And so when our colleagues in 2865, our graduate student colleagues, won their contract after a huge strike and a very hard-fought campaign, the UC is now using the emergency financial situation created by that to lay off lecturers. So, as you were describing, the bargaining never ends, the fight never ends, you have to fight hard to defend the contract. But, fortunately, at least at UCLA so far, because we won job security protections, they cannot fight. They cannot lay some of these people off without a huge fight. And we have grievability, and I know a lot of people whose jobs were saved. One of our leaders got to retire because we finally got a career pathway that includes like a senior lecturer position where you can actually retire. So, no regrets, fight on, and thanks for having me.
I like the idea of catastrophe. I think I described it as a profession in the middle of a transition. But yeah, I think catastrophe might do a better job of kind of describing the current situation. And I guess maybe this is a question for Marisa specifically, but I guess for everyone here, how did we get to this point? This idea of the neoliberal university. I know we have folks in the audience who are faculty members who might be more aware of kind of the state of higher education. But I think for maybe just the more generic kind of labor conference attendee, they might not be aware of kind of like what's been changing in higher ed over the years. And I think obviously I'm about as biased as they come, but it's pretty frightening. Do you want to speak to that? Maybe.
Well, this is how I explain it to my students. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, public higher education was a public good, and now part of that's because of the Cold War, right? But it was worth it for us to tax ourselves as a society so that we could provide higher education, not on equal terms, right? With all of these caveats, but education was seen as a public and social good that was paid for with public money. And so what's happened is public disinvestment in higher education, right? Tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts. So the cost of higher education increases. So university administrators have to be entrepreneurial. Did I say something? Yeah, okay. They had to go out and find private money, which can do all sorts of things to distort an institution, and to use debt. Dustin Jenkins' book on municipal debt. To use debt, right? So in some senses, it's absurd. The same forces that are pushed for tax cuts for corporations and for the wealthy, then get rich by lending money to public institutions and to students, right, to provide public higher ed. So students are expected now to invest in themselves and in their own future, right? It's their responsibility. It's not a social responsibility. So, in very general terms, the model of how the institutions are run is as a business, right? And with those kinds of values, which are antithetical to the values that I think all of us hold dear, right? So, we all have other things to say.
I'll just make a recommendation. Julia Schleck has a lovely new book that's called Through to Knowledge. It's really wonderful. I won't synthesize it here. Just to say that I think that's the top line thing that she talks about is that Americans no longer imagine the university as a public good. That we've lost that battle. And it's challenging in that she's like, throw it out. It was really hard to read. I'm like, oh, snap. We're working on a librarians campaign and thinking of hanging it on a slogan that's like fighting for the public good. And here she's like, let it go. Who cares? I'm like, oh my God. But yeah, I think she's basically, that's a losing argument. Appealing to people and trying to restore that sense of like, we're never going to get there. Which is challenging, but I think worth sort of thinking about that we've really lost that fight. And we were just talking before the panel started about our students and how they're kind of they're taking way too many classes, they're working, they think it's a credential, they're not there to learn, they're not there to, I literally in my comments last quarter had students saying, I really learned something. Yes, that's what you're here to do, but because it's completely changed the way they think about what they're doing and what the project is. And that to me is part of the catastrophe, I would just say.
I can't add anything more wonderful than what we've heard, but I'll just add this, that in this, whether we talk about it as a corporatization of the universities, whether we talk about the withdrawal or the public disinvestment, what I've also seen is just the pure commodification of students. And this is a problem, again, where we are in a position to speak back to that. The other thing I wanted to talk about just briefly is also how the numbers within the university also tend to reinforce these processes. Because one of the things that I hadn't really thought about before I got involved with my union was the different economics of administrators and faculty. And what I mean by that is this. Faculty, when they leave an institution, generally leave at their highest rate of pay and are replaced by someone at the institution's lowest rate of pay. I have yet to find an administrator who takes less money than their predecessor. Which means that as this happens, more money gets shifted away from instruction and into the corporate structure of the university. So if you want to know how this corporatization is achieved, and I put this as a research project to any students in the room, find me the last university president who took less salary than their predecessor. And I'm not necessarily blaming the individuals involved here. That's the economics of many parts of the corporate world. But not only is that not traditionally the economics of our world, but it's the opposite economics to how they view us as faculty. Because they're eager often for us to retire. Because the savings coup that they get, hiring either someone contingent to replace a tenure-line faculty member, or hiring an assistant at the lowest possible salary that they believe they can advertise. So I think there's some built-in economics to this that skew this corporatization.
Yeah, just a real quick example of this is that when I started at Oregon State University, we had 20 tenure-track faculty members in the history department. We now have, I think, 12. The administrators say, we're doing great. the institution's doing great. Well, it's not come into history, and there's not even any discussion about hiring on the tenure track. I mean, tenure's dead, people. Tenure is dead.
Got a microphone. The second microphone was about. Yeah, I think the idea of, I'm looking out in the audience and seeing many of my students here, and like the way that the institutional perspective on students has changed over the years. From people to be invested in to people to be profited off of. It's really, it's frightening. And I think that's this idea of students are encouraged to sort of exercise their own entrepreneurial imperative, right? And it's radically transformed the profession. I'm kind of curious about the work that your faculty unions have done for the like bargaining for the collective good. Have you all managed to bargain for students? I know that the Rutgers situation right now, they're in addition to kind of the bread and butter issues, they're lobbying for more mental health services. They're lobbying to protect their undocumented students. And I think that kind of I'm just kind of thinking of our own institution here. Like the human infrastructure that a school like UWT lacks in terms of like parking and things like that. They seem kind of trivial, but at the same time, in terms of improving the student experience, which I think improves the faculty work experience. Do you have any examples you all can mention?
I have it in my hand, so I'm just gonna bargain. Anytime you're bargaining for faculty, you're bargaining for students. So our slogan of our campaign was faculty equity is student success. And I believe that every day. Having an overworked, underpaid, very contingent, freeway flying instructor is not gonna help your students. Just don't let that leave your mind. If you're organizing faculty, it's always about students. And the students can be very transformed by the campaigns. We saw in our campaign students asking questions about the way they were treated by the university, the way this university denies them those kind of support services. I cannot tell you how many times my students will tell me, you're the first faculty that's helped me at all, because the tenured folks are so overcommitted with admin work. The thing that happens when you lose those tenured colleagues, what's that line about the pain you're feeling as your missing colleague? I forget what that article is from. Because they're so overwhelmed with service requirements because you don't let untenured folks serve on those committees. And so we end up holding a ton of emotional weight for these students. And UC is so hard to navigate, but just being able to help them. But what you're saying, I think, is really interesting. The way we tend to do that at UC, at least, is through our coalition, or the UC Coalition. So right now, our big campaign is trying to get the state government to, or I think it's the UC, our relationship with the state government is very strange, but for undocumented students to be able to work as work studies. Because right now, they can't get jobs on campus because they don't have standing, if you will. So we try to do those things, but we really have to do that in coalition. We're not strong enough to do that on our own.
I was thinking too about affordable housing. Like you said, UCLA is the largest landlord in LA. It's can your students afford to live near campus? That's a major issue.
Just to finish that thought, that was the major thing about the graduate students campaign. That was their number one thing, is that we have housing insecurity that you have to address, you see. Not only would they not bargain about that, the day that we were protesting outside the Regents meeting, they announced their $500 million investment in Blackstone. I don't know if you know about Blackstone's new portfolio. Their new portfolio is scooping up campus housing. They see it as a lucrative, they have a particular fund that is going into all these lovely neighborhoods around our campuses, scooping up all the housing and corporatizing the ownership. So we wish, let's put it that way, we wish.
Yeah, I would say that the bargaining is one thing that unions do, right? And bargaining is governed by particular laws. In Oregon, there are mandatory subjects of bargaining. They have to negotiate, well, they don't think they do, but they do. They have to negotiate with us on wages and working conditions. Now, how we define working conditions, right? We define it much more broadly than they want to. But they can it's very difficult to get them to bargain over these other kinds of things. And I would say if super strong unions can do that, we are not at that point. But we have worked, the union framework, right, makes it much easier to partner with student organizations to wage non-bargaining kinds of campaigns, right? So when we had a group called, we have the university, the DEI office had this campaign, we have work to do. And so a student group formed called We Can Do the Work. And we partnered with them to try to not have armed police on campus. We lost that battle. We partnered with them to try to stop the expansion of our stadium. We lost that one. We did get a president fired, so that was exciting. But you know, same as you, right? It's important to remember that bargaining is just one very important, but just one thing that unions can do. What it also does is it teaches you how to organize. And so being able to use that in other spaces has been really important.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think on both fronts, I certainly agree. Anytime we're bargaining for faculty working conditions, we are bargaining about student learning conditions. And there's no way not to think about that. And a really good example of how that plays out in a good contract. So our contract at Western, and by the way, anyone interested, ufww.org, you can download it, look at it, it's a lot of fun. But in there, our section 9 of the contract is the workload section, which says that historic workload can only be changed in negotiation with faculty. In fact, faculty have to initiate the process to change our workload. The university can. And it further specifies that class size is a distinct component of workload. And what this came out of, in part, was we knew that that was what some in our institution wanted to do. And in fact, when the price came down in 08-09, the first thing our then provost tried to do was double class sizes in some units. And we were able to end that in a day. It was interesting that our former provost had not actually read the contract, but I'll leave that aside. That was in our contract, and that's one of those things that is such a clear example because we all know that the number of students who should be in a classroom is a pedagogical issue and not a financial issue in terms of what the outcome is going to be in the classroom. And so our ability to protect our working conditions is immediately protecting student learning conditions, and it's also working to make these coalitions. We work very closely on my campus with our student union and with our staff unions. And one of the things that's wonderful, one of the fun times in our experience at the union, so we did our second contract in the wake of that financial crisis. And it was, I will admit, described by at least one outlet in the country as the best faculty contract in America. I'll just throw in, this is not to, I guess, lighten the mood, because I do agree that it's a catastrophe, and in many ways tenure's dead, but to talk about what these kinds of contracts can achieve. In my history department, when I joined the department, we had 18 tenure track lines and 7 or 8 contingent faculty. Today we have 21 lines and 2 contingent faculty. And that is the result of 2 regular contingent faculty. When people are on leave, etc., we may have folks temporarily. But obviously, it's easy for me to say this, but I can point to the ways in which that's what having a strong contract achieved. That's what's having the support of those coalitions, students, staff, faculty together can achieve.
Excellent. I had one last question before we hand it over to the studio audience here. How do you convince colleagues that academic labor is labor, that they too are part of this larger story of the American working people? I feel like there's probably a big generational difference here.
So I do this in my class, actually. I teach labor history as well. I ask my students, okay, there are 3 million retail workers in the US right now. How many coal miners are there? Anyone wanna? Well, we can do this right now. Under over. What's the under over on the number of coal miners?
Yeah,
38,000 coal miners. Our entire perception of who is a worker is completely outdated and irrelevant, frankly. I mean, God bless the coal miners, but you know what? Coal miner, like, let's talk about what people do for work today. And the great Jane McAlevey talks about those of us that work in care economies as being uniquely positioned as the vanguard of labor movement today, because as she puts it, the point of the production is the community. So auto workers, they make a car, the person who's driving that car never has any relationship with the auto worker that makes their car. A nurse who gives someone healthcare, a teacher who works closely with their students and their parents. We are uniquely positioned to revive the labor movement because of those connections, and because of the fact that we're so entangled and embedded. And everything that we all just said about students and our relationship to students is indicative of that, right? Like that's, you have to do it. There's no way you build power without them. So, you know, I'm less concerned, I think it's less specific, although of course there's ego and prestige, and I work at UCLA, the top public university in the country, but I think it's less about, I know.
Can't say that at the University of Washington.
I think it's less about convincing people that you're a worker and more about having a more honest conversation about the fact that we live in a service economy, and what to me is what makes you, you know, working class today is whether you're precarious. And if you feel that precarity, if you know that you're one paycheck away from getting evicted or not being able to have your car or not being able to, you know, pay for your healthcare bill or what have you, then as far as I'm concerned, you're working class. It's not a proletarian, Marxist, happy birthday, argument, but it's the honest conversation that we need to have about work in the United States today, is what I would say.
Yeah, I'm gonna to go next because I agree, but I also disagree a little bit because I lean right into telling faculty, yes, you're a worker and you're insane to have thought that you weren't. And let's not divide ourselves into different categories of workers. Let's understand that if you have a boss, you're a worker. And many of us, I mean, the academy is interesting because many of us want to claim that we don't have a boss. But that works until you need to get a travel request approved. That works until you don't get paid on time, which the universities, at least in this state, are really good at doing, is not paying people on time. And especially on Marx's birthday, you know, I'll go back to an early conversation I had with a colleague after we'd won our union. And this was a dyed-in-the-red-wool Marxist who said to me, do we have to call them shop stewards? And I won't, I'll try and be polite, I won't say exactly what I said back in terms of the profanity. But basically I said yes, because you are a worker and your representative is going to be a steward who is here to be what we haven't had before. That is someone who can intervene directly on an equal basis with the boss. And I think, and again, I'm not disagreeing, but I want to lean into this because I think the important thing is faculty at every level, and faculty, because of how deeply hierarchical our working world is. The problem with many of our colleagues is what they want to do is police the boundaries of their privilege. Well, I'm at least not contingent, or I'm an associate, etc. And the reality is, all of that promotes this false consciousness that somehow we're independent contractors. Or if we're good friends with the dean, maybe we don't have to worry about it because we get taken care of. And the reality is, faculty are workers. Now, I think the distinction, and I really appreciate this, the distinction between blue collar, white collar needs to really go away. Because labor is so varied from what it was back when those terms got fixed in place. But the important thing, I think, is to shape faculty by their, you know, especially the older ones, by their corduroy patch lapels, and say, you're a worker, you deserve to have a voice in your working conditions. And it's remarkable, except in a few areas, and I won't go into that, but there are some places on every campus that are privileged. And that place may vary from campus to campus. But some faculty are well taken care of. And that's a problem in the system, that it is not equitable. What collective bargaining offers is the opportunity to make that equitable. And in my experience, even with these faculty who don't want to see themselves as workers, and in some cases because they've escaped a working class background, and they want to think of themselves as having arrived in a different world. And it's really important to tell them, yes, in terms of your, I guess, working indoors, or you're not working on an assembly line, but no, in the sense that you still have a boss. And unless you take power, the boss is going to decide your working conditions for you.
Yeah, I'll just add that, growing precarity, in 1970, 70% of faculty were tenure track or tenured, and 30 were not, and it's reversed now. I think, it's a much easier sell among non-tenure track faculty, honestly. Ideas of privilege, ideas of professional status are still really powerful. Oregon State University administration would never give anything but merit raises. We finally got them to give across-the-board raises. Those merit raises, some units would use them for across the board, and others would use them for merit, and they ended up increasing inequity across campus. But that whole idea of excellence, 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 right? And a lot of faculty, particularly those on the tenure track, buy into that. It's deeply rooted in their own self-identity. And part of it is, to tell a story, my partner is also faculty at OSU, and he works in the vet college. And he was talking to a colleague about the union, and they said, well, I'm doing great. Everything's good for me. And you can't get away with this if you're anyone, but my partner did. He said, well, what to fucking do for you? And the next day, the colleague said, you're right, and signed a card. So I think, I think that in some ways, moving some of my colleagues through frustration about shared governance and transparency and budgets and those other sorts of issues that aren't necessarily directly about working conditions. And then once they're involved, once you know more about your colleagues around campus and you recognize the hierarchies and you recognize what some people are going through, then I think you start to see, oh yeah, we're workers.
Excellent. All right, well, I want to hand it over to our audience. You all have been fantastic thus far. I'm sure you have some great questions. And I do have a volunteer. Pass the microphone around. She's being compensated, of course.
I wondered about that.
Hi, so I'm a recent graduate from the University of Puget Sound over in the north end here. Pretty much the entire time I was a student there, the administration was constantly talking about all these austerity measures they needed to introduce, which I think is pretty ubiquitous across the board on campuses. But at the same time, I did some research myself and looked into how much the administration was getting paid. The president made like $500,000. The two provosts made like $300,000 something. They spent $100 million on building a new like welcome center for new students, which was pretty strongly opposed on campus because nobody thought we needed a welcome center. But my first question is, what is a provost? Because I genuinely don't know what it is. And my second question is, if there's, they're spending money on all these things, they're, no more tenure track, no more this, no more that, austerity across the board. What is there, from the administration's viewpoint, what's their, vision of what the university should look like?
Oh gosh. By the way, first of all, the provost is someone we grieve. The provost is the chief academic officer of an institution, and that typically also involves budgetary authority for academic affairs. The provost is generally the CEO of academic affairs, and then at most institutions, then they're at the vice president level, because then there are other vice presidents for student affairs, for business affairs, etc. But usually they're like the number 2 on campus after the president or chancellor. I am not going to pretend to be able to answer your second question and say what the vision of an institution that is selling a narrative of poverty is, because I don't see much vision behind it. But I just want to take this opportunity as someone in the state of Washington, with all of you as at least in-state peers, to say this. The narrative of poverty and austerity that we have been sold in the state about our public institutions is simply not accurate. And what that relates to is the fact that we don't have a seat at the table to insist. I mean, we do at Western, but you don't, faculty at UPS don't, faculty at the University of Washington don't, faculty at Washington State University don't, etc., to say, open up the books and show us. The reality is, and this is part of the neoliberalization aspect of this, faculty and students and staff at universities are convinced by their institutions that there is some sort of zero-sum game economics in play, that they have a fixed amount of resources that they have determined, and that they can't meet all of their priorities, so everybody has to give more. The reality is, not that we don't need more public investment in higher ed, because we do. Exactly the point that Marisa made. However, our institutions are not the public institutions I'm talking about. I don't know UPS's financial statements, etc., but they're not sinking into the abyss of poverty. They're building new buildings. They are very, very attentive to make sure their bond ratings don't suffer.
Yes.
I don't ever hear about the bond companies having to suffer the austerity that the rest of us do. And I think the way I would reframe it, because I can't speak to their vision, is what this shows you is what their priorities are. And their priorities aren't people. That's a way you can speak back to this problem.
Yeah, we're gonna try for that one. You can bet that Welcome Center was paid for with borrowed money that will continue to be paid for, and they're building it because they're competing for students. They wanna build luxury dorms, they wanna build fancy stadiums and welcome centers, because they want student tuition dollars.
During our, so at UC, we don't just have a provost, we have we have chancellors, executive vice chancellors, we have executive vice presidents, we have special,
They're all very busy.
they're all very busy, and no one, the thing that you'll find when you do campus organizing is it's all a giant Spider-Man meme. You know, the one where they're all literally, we were having meetings with state legislators during our campaign, asking them for help, and they were like, we have no control over the university. Everyone has their finger out, pointing at someone else, feigning responsibility. And I think all of us, students, faculty alike, have dealt with how frustrating that is when something goes wrong, when you don't get paid on time. And you call, we can't even call, they got rid of our phones at UC, so we can't even call anyone anymore. You have to fill out an online form that spits an email into some poor entry-level administrator who is just drowning, it's terrible. So all I'll say is a big fight, especially in the wake of this Blackstone investment that I mentioned before, is we're demanding budget transparency, and that's about the best you can do, right? Is say you need to show us that you are impoverished, because you can't, out of one end of your mouth, say we have to lay people off because we have to, they're writing checks their butt can't cash, basically. And the state of California's government is completely exasperated. They're tired of the UC coming to them with their hat out and then making $500 million investments in a hedge fund at the same time. They are just as frustrated. But that's like, in your power analysis, campus organizing, that's the first thing to figure out, is who does the buck actually stop with? Because it might not be the provost. It might be someone above the provost, like a board of directors, or trustees, or who knows what. It's regents for us. All those regents are hedge fund managers. I don't think any of them give a shit about school, about education at all. They're there because they are good at making money grow. And that is why they have those jobs. And it's an infuriating thing that I can't help but provide any solve for.
I just wanted to follow up on that question. I'm at another Washington University, Washington State, which is not unionized. And so my question for you all is how successful you've been in pushing back on administrative density, because we know that across the country, and certainly in this region, that the numbers of provosts, vice presidents, vice chancellors keeps multiplying as tenure lines are disappearing. So how have unions been able to effectively challenge that use of priorities of funds?
Yeah, and on my campus at least, we call them deanlets and provostlets, and they seem to proliferate. And look, that is another one that you can't really go head on. But what I will say is this: what we've been able to do on my campus is have lots of very, very open conversation about this that has been very difficult for our administration. We did have a period after we unionized where our administration pared down, in part because we made such a public issue of the fact that their share of the budget was growing so quickly relative to academic affairs. And so the only answer I have for you, which is not necessarily the best one, is shame.
So I have multiple questions in one. My first one would be, on all of your campuses, did you have multiple campuses like this? Like we have UW and then we have Seattle. And if so, how did you get them to come together? Second question is, you have students coming out of high school that I call the COVID kids. What is the impact of that on the learning and what y'all are going through right now?
We were just talking about that second one before. We have 3 campuses and also extension offices and campus faculty, and it's very, very difficult. I will tell you that the bulk of our faculty is on the Corvallis campus, and the bulk of our members are on the Corvallis campus. We do phone banking. We used to have a couple union activists out at Cascades and Bend, but one of the challenges, we have a lot of turnover among our non-tenure track instructional and research faculty. And so the people most likely to be real involved in the union tend to be people who are pissed off and unhappy. Not always, right? But and those people leave. So we have a lot of turnover. We have not solved this issue yet of how to really bring together folks. I mean, Zoom actually really helped. It's sort of this paradigm change, right? And now we do our meetings hybrid, and so folks from other campuses can be participating. Maybe y'all have other.
Yeah, I will say, Western situation is not the same as the U. The U and its multi-campus system is much more structured than what we have. We do have a number of sites away from Bellingham, though, including on the peninsula and south of Seattle. The distances involved aren't great, but my basic answer to this is that, in my experience, the core issues that engage faculty in the opportunities that collective bargaining offers are going to be the same wherever you find them. You just meet them in their space. And the reality is, that, I mean, this is most shocking when you find yourself in the office of a professor, let's say of accounting, who by the end of it has the epiphany that actually they need faculty in the business school to be unionized too. And that's a lovely moment. But the reality is, with our campus, what we dealt with was there was a significant disparity between the main campus and the off-campus sites in terms of the density of contingent labor at the off-campus sites was greater. In many ways, of course, this made it a little easier to organize off-campus because their issues were that much more pressing because of the precarity. But my experience is this is not a problem. It's not a problem at all, and it's not an issue we should shy away from. The reality is, whether you are a historian, and I'm glad we've got such a history-heavy panel, but whether you're in the humanities, social sciences, the natural sciences, whether you're in business, whether Western doesn't have a medical school, other institutions will. The reality is, the core issues that bring us together around collective bargaining, shared governance, transparency, a seat at the table, those are sellers, whether you are in Bremerton or Bellingham. And so I think making sure that the message is genuinely bottom-up and democratic is how you bring in places that may be away from the center of the university or the way you organize a multi-campus place.
Yeah, I mean, UC, there's 10 campuses. They're very different. At UC Merced, our newest UC, it's 60% of the courses are taught by contingent faculty. At UCLA, where I teach, it's more like 30%. We were doing Zoom before everyone did Zoom because we have to do, because our governance structure depends on that. So one thing I would say is that you're gonna develop a governance structure that proportionately represents everyone. So we have equal representation on all our committees, And when needed, we have proportional representation. So our statewide council, the big campuses, because we're significantly bigger. I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat that. There are 750 lecturers at UCLA, there are 60 at UCLA. So we have to have some proportion there. But we also have to really recognize that the dynamics and the issues are different, right? I mean, again, I'm really not here to brag about UC that I'm on UW's campus, but UCLA and UC Berkeley are the two best public, whatever, that's what they like to say, the best public higher education in the country. And that's not the same for UCR and UC Merced. So one of the ways we addressed that actually was we took it to the state, because what we found was Riverside and Merced are our two highest BIPOC student populations, and they get the least amount of funding. And so one of our campaigns was to drive at that and to try to balance those inequities, because we know that hurts faculty too, right? When you center students in your work, you see those interconnections. So it can't always, democratic governance is the one protection, and then choosing to foreground those issues and sort of fight harder for those campuses that feel that underrepresentation is two. I think I'm not going to sugarcoat, those tensions will endure, particularly during our strike campaign. The gaze of the media, for example, was like really intense for us at UCLA and UC Berkeley, and it was really hard for us to get press to go out and cover the other campuses, to pay attention to them. And there's a lot of pressure that comes. I mean, I was literally talking to reporters like all day for like 3 days leading up to our strike, in a way that creates a lot of anxiety. It was really scary. Randy Weingarten came to town. It was like, oh man. She's like, who do you know in the left? I don't know anyone, Randy. What are you talking about? Anyways, but I think you have to be real about that, and I think you have to go into it eyes open and create structures that ensure that at least that is acknowledged and said out loud and recognized, because otherwise it does become this kind of bowling over. Decisions are made by the big campuses that the small campuses have more trouble with or don't agree with. Right now we're trying to pass a dues increase. I'm sure the two of you can testify that is not easy, and we're hearing a little bit of that from our small campuses as it relates to how you allocate resources, right? So we have a full-time staff person at UCLA, they don't at UC Riverside. They have one staff person, they split between 3 of those campuses. So actually our staff union is trying to address that right now, and we're thinking about bringing a motion to our statewide council as well. So it's not easy, we can do it though. I mean, we sustain that unity regardless, and when as you say, when it comes down to it, all of us have the same experience. It's not really that different.
Hi, thanks everyone for the panel. I did want to respond and push back to the coal miner comment, say that we should thank coal miners and learn from their struggles, whether it's the Warrior Met Coal strike, which was one of the longest in recent history, the Battle of Blair Mountain, which was one of the largest labor uprisings, certainly the largest labor uprising period after the Civil War. And I think, what it, for me, reflects the kind of neoliberalization of the university has also meant the stripping of labor, labor history, and maybe not as some of the institutions that we're part of, but certainly even where we do have a presence of labor education, when I talk to students, they've never heard about any of this. And I think that reflects the kind of the depth of neoliberalization at our universities, that any consideration of labor and labor history has been stripped out. And I think that, I just end with this and you can respond, but I think academics could benefit a lot from learning about working class militancy and the sacrifice of miners, and to sort of understand that what we're talking about is sort of stepping into an arrangement of labor relations which is contingent on these earlier struggles, which was set in place because of these earlier struggles, and that how much an industry can change because the ruling class maintains control. So I just wanted to say that.
Forgive me. Before I teach labor history, I study labor history. I have not in any way to begrudge the contributions of miners. I do think, however, we have a problem with our colleagues citing the fact that, well, we don't need to use, we're not miners. We're not being exploited like that. Yes, you are. You are being exploited every fucking day. You are being just as undervalued and just as underpaid sure, we don't get the black lung, right? We're not sent into, like, our lives, our physical lives are not, I mean, I guess they were during the pandemic, I'm gonna take that back. Just to say that I think we fetishize a certain type of worker that it disables us from recognizing the fact that we are workers as well. So I don't mean to dismiss the contributions of the minors at all. I study labor militants, I write about communists and socialists and the fucking CIO. You don't have to tell me that, I understand that. I just mean to say that I think there is a problem in our contemporary society. That I hear this all the time in regards to the Starbucks workers, for example. Of like, these are just whiny, you know, weird Gen Z, whiny queer kids who, they're not really workers, they don't really, what are they doing striking? They don't need to go on strike. Pity the poor Starbucks worker. Screw that, right? I mean, the miners were told the same thing before Clear Mountain, right? Like, the devaluation of the jobs people actually have needs to also adjust with the job supply. That's the only point I was making. I know you understand that, and I don't mean to, you know, thank you for, sorry. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a race and a gender implication
Yes.
too, the kind of the way that American labor has sort of like cemented in the popular imagination of America. It's, I mean, the working class hasn't gone anywhere. It just looks different than it did, you know, a generation ago, 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago. And it's, I mean, I think it's telling that this turn toward the neoliberalization of universities just so happened to coincide with Title IX, you know, more women entering university, more people of color entering university, more women and people of color getting jobs at universities. All of a sudden these jobs aren't quite as prestigious as they used to be. That's, yeah, I mean, it's no coincidence.
Thanks so much. My name is Ryan Schmeltz. I'm on the executive board for the Washington Federation of State Employees, Local 443 down in Olympia. Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank you all so much. It's very fascinating to hear from this perspective. I don't really have an academic background. Second of all, I'd also like to thank you for talking about this. In Washington State, I'm sure many of you already know, there's been a lot of political back and forth between the historic labor movement, particularly in forests. A lot of people that lost out in neoliberalism. So when I hear like coal miner, I think of like the woodworkers. A lot of that, you know, there's a lot of radical history there, but a lot of those guys lost out in areas that used to be completely, you know, you just have socialist and communist labor halls. Now it's all Trump land, and we lost a lot of that during the Clinton administration. And the labor movement in Washington, I'm sure also elsewhere, has this political divide, right? So one of the things that I'm certainly trying to do as a member of our local Thurston Lewis Mason Central Labor Council is trying to bridge this like political divide between, you know, the slightly more conservative unions who feel like, you know, the big liberal unions don't care about them, you know, the labor movement doesn't care about them, you know, people that end up voting very conservative or living in more rural areas, trying to bridge that and trying to win those folks over with some of the more mainstream unions and where that labor movement's going. That's really my hope. So when I heard those comments, it really shaped me a little bit, but thank you so much for clarifying. My question then is, where do you, actually I have it typed out here, is the work of cross-union collaboration meaningfully being done with the faculty unions? And explain some of the challenges being faced by those trying to strengthen this relationship and how to overcome it from your perspective and experiences.
Yeah, so I'll speak to that briefly because I speak to it in the state, because on my campus, there are 2 staff unions that we work with. One is PSC local and one is WFC local. And what we've tried to do is to coordinate our efforts and support each other's bargain. And so one of the things that's been really important on our campus has also just been being really open and upfront with our union partners on campus. So we let the union leaders of the other unions on campus know what our goals are in bargaining. What we don't want them to be surprised. You know, what we don't want to do is create the impression that somehow faculty are more deserving of a voice at the table than any other labor group on campus. And so what we try and do is lift everybody up through working together. And in fact, when I was president of our local, which was 09 to 13, one of my closest working relationships was the president of our staff PSC local. And in fact, that we were so in touch with each other proved to be an enormous way to share information that the institution actually would rather have kept silent. So I've seen the importance of reaching out and reaching across those boundaries. and how much benefit it brings to everyone involved. And we would not have the strong faculty union we have on my campus without the support of our staff unions and also without the support of our students. I don't want to leave them out, but in the long term, especially in our when we were organizing and then going into first contract, the support that we got from our staff unions was invaluable, and we've tried to pay that back and pay it forward.
Yeah, we similarly are in coalition with our classified staff union at OSU, or with SEIU. And I would just say that I've been a little bit involved with HELU, which is Higher Ed Labor United, which is a national effort to try to build wall-to-wall unions on our campuses that include all workers on campuses, from students to faculty to staff to hospital employees, et cetera, right? And I think that's a really positive direction to that effort is making sure that it brings folks from all of those constituencies into the leadership of that group to set the direction. And so I agree with you that we are all workers and we need to support each other and build a common agenda.
Yeah, I apologize again for being glib about my remarks before, but I'll share a little anecdote from Los Angeles where the head of the County Federation of Labor was caught on tape, surreptitiously recorded making really incendiary racist remarks, and was asked to resign. And the Fed meeting, I'm a delegate to the Fed, and the meeting right after it, a group of teachers, led by Marina Jula, who's a big leader in Black Lives Matter, interrupted the meeting and basically, one after another, got up in front of the room and lectured people about racism. Now, do I think that's a bad thing? No. We all need to understand racism, right? Is that a bad look to have a bunch of teachers go up in front of a room of wage workers and lecture them about teaching? Yeah, it is. It was a terrible look. Everyone was annoyed. People of color were annoyed. Maybe the LA Fed is very, very, very diverse, and they did not need a bunch of teachers going up and barking at them. So I think all of this is true. We work in coalition as well, but one of the things I tell our people is we need to show up and listen to other workers and learn from them. And your point about Blair Mountain is well taken. There's an incredible illiteracy about labor. I need some of these like post-colonial scholars who know everything about everything, subaltern, yada-hoo, and you ask them what is the economy of Los Angeles, and they don't know what people do for work around them and in their communities. So I actually would say that it's on us to listen and learn from those workers you're talking about, to understand how lumber workers feel, having been so displaced and sort of corporatized. And if we don't take it upon ourselves to listen, it's not, you can't just go out and teach, right? We can't just go out and tell them about how hard it is to work at the university. I'm sure you're laughing at what I'm doing that right now, but just to say, as anyone who organizes knows, 90% listening, 10% talking, and I think that's true of coalition building as well. You gotta show up for people and you gotta listen to them and learn something about what they're going through before you can claim to be in full solidarity. So thank you for being here, frankly, because you're doing that work right now. We appreciate it.
Nice. Well, join me in thanking our panel here for